So this is going to be part one of the Q&A with Abel. We're going to have this on my channel, and then part two will be on his channel. So we'll have a link below. Go ahead and check out his channel for part two. And if you guys have other questions you want answered on the next Q&A, go ahead and post below.
All right, everybody. So today, back on the podcast, another Q&A with Abel Csabai. How are we doing, man?
Hey, I'm good. Finally, book writing is done. So I'm looking forward to making more videos again. No conflict when I sit down to do something. Like, should I be making a video because I shouldn't abandon my channel completely, or should I be writing on the books? Like, I'm bad at setting priorities for myself like that. So now it's clear.
So now you're going to see Abel on the podcast game. He's going to be on everybody's podcast promoting his book. He's got when is it Joe Rogan? Is it next week or 2 weeks from now?
Yeah, well, I somehow need to create some attention there. But although his new studio is very intimidating. That old one I liked a lot more. It was like very friendly looking. Yeah. But yeah, I'm gonna be like one of those, like, always finding an excuse to mention the book somehow.
Right.
So
yeah. So I know you sent it to me, and so my brother actually just wrote a novel recently, and I told him I will finish it by 2025 because I will go through audiobooks like crazy, podcasts like crazy, articles. Somebody sends me an article, I'll just read it right away. But books, as I was saying before we started calling, like, I only read books when I'm ready to go to sleep at night as a way to wind down. And it's such a surefire way to get me to sleep. I'll read 2 pages and I'm out. So I'll finish your ebook probably around 2026, I think.
Yeah, but it's kind of crazy. Like, I'm actually the same way. So, and like, it kind of makes sense that reading is more sleep inducing than watching a video, let's say. But by how much, I'm always surprised. So if I'm watching a video on YouTube or something in bed, then I can stay away for a very long time. Whereas with reading, it just like immediately.
It is kind of amazing. Like, I will have numerous times where it's like, let's say it's 10 p.m. and I'm like, well, I should start getting down soon, but I'm completely awake. And then I'll get in bed and I'll sometimes just have the book in my hand and I'm just kind of thinking for a minute. And then I'm just out. Like, it's so quick with books for me, which is funny because, like I said, when I read articles like on my laptop, it's no problem. I'll go through them pretty quickly. But something about that, which again, it's nice because a lot of people have a very hard time falling asleep. So to have something that can kind of just take care of it is nice.
Yeah. For me as well. Like, for me to hang out in the living room and, like, I don't know, play PlayStation or something, and then feel like, okay, I cannot keep my eyes open. For that, I need to be incredibly, incredibly tired. But yeah, in bed, it immediately flips. So kind of just like it illustrates the importance of actually having a routine and not just leaving it up to, I mean, for some people, it probably is different. But for me, like, it's important to have a routine and not just leave it up to when I feel tired.
Sure. All right, so we've got another batch of questions here for Q&A. So for people who are just tuning in, we do these Q&As probably every month or two, a couple months, I would say. And if you send like a DM, that's a good way to get the questions answered. Sometimes on the YouTube comments, I would say Instagram, though, is probably the best bet. So we'll start off here. We've got Hung No, which I'm definitely saying his name incorrectly. Let's see. So, hey, Dave, I've been listening to a lot of Abel's older podcasts with Borge Fagerli and listened to your episode with him. What's your thoughts on desensitization phase and not training for 2 weeks? Is there value doing that for an average lifter only interested in hypertrophy? Do muscles actually get detrained so it triggers more stimulus with lighter volume? All right. You want to go first? Because I know you had a lot of work with Borge and all that.
Yeah, so that was an interesting time, and actually, sometimes I'm planning on, or sometimes I'm contemplating doing some long video on actually talking through how that whole period was with Berge, because it's like, seriously, not just from a training and like fitness education standpoint, but also from like existential standpoint. But anyways, so yeah, That's one of those things that I had a hard time, I guess, just mentally being on board with, because it's not what I would prefer to do, for sure. Taking 2 weeks off to get some kind of a resensitization benefit. And like, I personally cannot say that I've ever experienced coming back from a layoff and then getting past my previous best surprisingly fast. But from others, I have heard anecdotes like that. So for that reason, like, I think that is one of those things like rest pause or ultra high frequencies or weighted stretching or like a lot of these things that are interesting ideas. I don't think enough people have vetted it out so that we could like really have any kind of clear idea as to like what we can expect from it. But I don't like, it seems a little bit woo-woo to me. Like, typically you do things and then you do them consistently. If you do too much, then you need to lay off a little bit, like need to reset things a little bit, like let that fatigue dissipate. But typically things just don't work like that in life, that like you hack the system by like pretending like you're stopping with it and then you're new to the stimulus again and then you stimulate again and then this magical thing happens. Usually it's not how it works. But I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so I am not a big practitioner of that. I think deloads and the like are fine, but that's a little bit different, right? It's like, okay, you know, your body needs a little bit of a break. Maybe it's a mental break that you need. That, in my opinion, is different. But like this desensitization kind of stuff, like the hypertrophy specific training guy, Brian Haycock,
Yeah.
Haycock, yeah, you know, he talks about this a lot. I just don't think I don't think there's too many examples where just physiologically, where just backing off is then going to result in this increased stimulus that's going to net you further than you would have been. So what I mean by that is, it is true that after let's say you detrained for a month, right? When you come back, it is true that a smaller stimulus will create a response, but it doesn't matter if it creates a response. You want to eventually have a response that gets you past where you were. Right. So like, you know, anybody will tell you if you took a year off from training, when you come back, you're going to grow like a weed. But is that going to then allow you to get further than you ever were? No, I don't think so. And an example of this would be like, if you were to be like, what would you, if you're trying to get as tan as possible, would you think it's going to be better to be outside every day for a week? Or would it be better to be outside for 2 days, then take, you know, a day off and then 2 days? Like maybe when you come back from a little bit of time off, you'll get a little bit extra burned or tan, but not more than the accumulation would have been over that week. You know, I don't think you'd get past that point. I don't think it's something that's super useful. I know like that's a principle that RP uses with like, you know, their deloads and whatnot in the mesocycles, and the idea being that once you have the time off, then you'll need a less stimulus. I don't see it play out like that. I don't see the guys who are using desensitization. I don't see the guys who are using, you know, these frequent deloads getting further than anybody else. I think it's fine. Like, I don't think it's worse necessarily. I'm not saying these guys are getting worse results. I just don't think it's doing what people claim it does.
Agreed.
Okay, so this was an interesting question by Liam Bonner. I'm a fan of the podcast. I was wondering, how many inches of abs/oblique/lower back muscle did you put on your waistline from when you were 18 until your current size? Which actually I think is a great question, because you know, it's very clear that bigger guys generally are not going to have very tiny waistlines. I mean, obviously at the extreme, you look at like the IB pros, like Jay Cutler, probably on stage had a 36 plus inch waist, I'm guessing, right, with how big some of these guys' stomachs get. But just from more muscle mass. So I don't know if you have records like that, Abel. I can tell you that for me, I had pictures back when I was about 130 pounds and I had about a 29 inch waist, and I was not that lean. Like, I couldn't see my abs. I was probably 14% body fat or something, but just no muscle at all. And I had a 29 inch waist. Now at that same body fat, which is basically where I'm at now, I'm a little above that now. I'm probably like 16, 17% now. So at 14%, I'd say 32, maybe even 32 and a half inch waistline. So, I mean, you're talking probably a good 3 inches. But I'm also sitting about 195, right? So 190, 195 at that body fat. So, you know, 60 pounds of mass later, probably about 3 inches, I would say.
Yeah. So I'm thinking now, and I think that when I first got lean, like it, like 10%, probably a bit under. Looking back, maybe like 9%. At the time, I was like, like 75 kilos ish.
Mhm.
And then I know that if I flexed my abs as hard as I could, then my waist was around like 78 centimeters off and under. And like now, last summer, I was not 9% body fat, but like close to 10-ish, like mid-low 80s, body weight wise. And then my waist was like, like 84, 85 centimeters, like thereabouts, fluctuating there, flexed, like air blown out.
Yeah.
So that's, what is that? It's similar to yours, right? Like that's a bit less than 3 inches, 2.5 inches.
Yeah. So, and just a reminder, people, I mean, waistline is really, I think, a great overall tool to use. I'm big on measurements, but you just got to keep in mind that they're just one tool, right? So arm measurements, they might go up, but did you just gain a ton of body fat? Waistline, just because it did go up, doesn't mean that you necessarily are fatter over a long period of time. Like if you're doing like a 1-year bulk and your waistline's going up, like, you almost certainly have gained some fat around there. But, we're talking like decade plus and 50 pounds of mass later, then yes, of course, it is going to go up over time. And that's where calipers and whatnot would be very
and
useful.
probably your shoulders will have gone up as well in that time. So your V taper ratio is same or better.
Right. Yep. All right. So this one is a long one. So I'll read quickly. Cole Henry, actually a former client of mine. Hey, Dave, hope you're doing well. Wanted to ask for some training advice if you don't mind. At this point, I'm almost 4 years into training, basically shifted from prioritizing aesthetics to strength. Still care about muscles, care about getting stronger more. Been stuck on a few key lifts. Let's see, squat, bench, weighted chins, OHB. Bench is 270 for 4. Chins at 200 pounds body weight is 95 times 3. Good job, man. Squat is 345 times 5, and OHP 200 times 3. So, just first I'll just say that's quite good for just now 4 years in. Train every other day, 4 times a week. I train each of those lifts 1 to 2 times per week. I've seen some of your lifts. You're really strong considering your body weight. So do you think, since I've been stuck for a few months here, it's time to switch up the frequency or volume of those lifts? Or at this point in my training, should I only expect improvement after like 3 or 4 months? Was there anything you did in particular, similar point in your strength, that helped you push through plateaus? I understand this loaded question. Cool. So I can go first on that one. Pretty involved. So, and actually, again, Cole, this guy is on the shorter end. I don't remember the exact height, but again, 200 pounds body weight to be doing that with the pull-ups and everything is quite good. So first of all, I would just say you are getting to that level of strength where for most people, things are definitely going to slow down. I mean, obviously there are some phenoms who that's their beginning weight, and then there's some people who never surpass that. But that is definitely a level of strength that things will start to slow down. And I don't think just like the completely basic programming is necessarily going to work. I would say I'm not super big on just initially increasing a ton of volume. I don't know what your weekly volume is for these lifts. I do like increased frequency from a practice standpoint. And I do also like accessory lifts, and not to the extent like a West Side barbell type where they're just doing so many variations and where at some point you're almost not even doing something that's that similar. But I do think some variations can be helpful, and then coming back to it. So like if we take a squat, for example, right, very common advice would be to say, all right, try pause squats. So if you're just doing like regular squats there, keep the bar position the same, but go and like hold a pause position. I think Craig Knuckles actually had a period where he said he gained a shocking amount of strength by just doing very long pauses at the bottom to get your explosive strength up. Another option would be a box squat, right, where it's allowing you to kind of get to a certain depth. Maybe that's even above parallel. That would be focusing on a different sticking point, obviously, than maybe doing a deep pause. So I would say recording yourself on these lifts and seeing where the weakest point is, because a lot of times people think, okay, like let's say you're halfway up on a bench and you think, well, this is my sticking point. Well, just that may be your sticking point, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's exactly where you need to work. You may need to work below that sticking point to increase your strength there to push past the sticking point, right? So I might try out some different ranges of motion. Again, pause work I think is good, and see what can push past that point, that with increased frequency is probably where I would start. And then obviously nutritionally, this isn't probably going to help the pull-ups very much, but for the big three for sure, just if you want to add strength, obviously being in a calorie surplus is always helpful there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even really have that much to add to that per se. Was actually going to ask back, like, so this guy's goal was strength specifically, so it's not just like progressing in general to get bigger and then using these lifts as a benchmark.
It sounds like now he's prioritizing the strength specifically.
Okay. So I was going to ask, like, regarding the range of motion and like where your sticking point is, like, so how do you think about that? Because that thought process that, okay, you need to work on certain areas within the lift where you tend to fail. I mean, it could make sense, but then there's the alternative, right? Which is like you're failing the lift there simply because that's where your muscles are just not leveraged well. So it's always going to be your sticking point no matter what you do. So like you can get stronger there, but you have to fail the lift somewhere. So like there's always going to be a sticking point. You cannot just eliminate that. So basically just lift normally, and then eventually you will get stronger. So how do you think about that generally?
Yeah, I don't think anybody really has a perfect answer on that. I remember back years ago, Ben Escrow, who was a Lane Norton strength coach for a while. He might still be, I'm not sure. And I remember him saying how he wasn't a fan of band work or anything like that. Because it was all about the lifts. Like he was all about specificity, because he was like, that's the lift, like that's what we want to focus on. Whereas other people, it's bands, it's chains, it's so many variations. And they only, again, like Westside, they might only do an actual deadlift every couple of months, right? So and regarding like the sticking point, of course, you are going to fail at some point. And is that sticking point going to change dramatically? I think most people, just again, based on the biomechanics of it, are going to probably fail at a similar place. Like if I think of every squat I've ever failed, it's usually a few inches out of the hole, right? Like I don't think I've ever failed a squat where I'm like 4 inches away from getting it and then I just can't get it, right? It's usually like a pretty similar spot. Which is why, again, I am a fan of the pause work, because I think for most people, you're going to have this point. Let's take a OHP. If you're watching this on video, it's like here. If I don't get it, it's like right there, right? And then I guess, and actually OHP specifically, I have had a couple times where I just am like up there and I just can't lock it out. But most of the time, it is same with bench press. Most of the time, if you get it past that halfway point, you're going to get it. That's why I'm a big fan of like the pause work. When I had a powerlifting coach, he had me doing a lot of the paused work, a lot of like triples and singles at that in that paused area. He was a lot of triples and singles at that stretched part of the range of motion. And that was when I had actually increased my deadlift like 100 pounds in a year. It was a very good gaining phase for me. A lot of, in the case of deadlifts, it was a lot of deficit dead. So again, it was getting to that like really end range of motion and kind of increasing explosive power. I don't know if that answers your question. I guess you're specifically saying like, how do you determine it? And I guess I would say I'm leaning more towards the stretched bottom position of these lifts.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, yeah, that's about as much I had to add to that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So we'll go to the Instagram questions here. So what do you guys think of Jordan Peters' approach of training to failure on all sets? Well, Jordan Peters, he's a psychologist, right? Big on the carnivore diet. So for people who don't get the joke, so Jordan Peterson, right? And then there's Jordan Peters. And then there was George Peterson, who was an IFBB pro. So there's a lot of similarities there. Yeah. But Jordan Peters is the one who people might know from Scott Stevenson. They pretty friendly. He was kind of more like following like the DC style. So what do you think, Abel?
So once again, what does Jordan Peters do? Because I got distracted by the Jordan Peterson thing.
What do you guys think of Jordan Peters' approach to training to failure on all sets? I believe he follows pretty similar, like DC, like all out style training.
Yeah. Well, So he is from what I've seen, he's one of these like lower volume, like super balls out kind of trainees and trainers. I think I like to train pretty intensely and with moderate volumes, and I'm not sure. So I think that he might be doing the failure thing like a bit more literally than most people do it. So he's actually failing reps. I'm inclined to say that is probably not the best allocation of recovery resources. So I like to get all the reps that I can get, like a full rep. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a perfectly clean rep. So I'm okay with a little bit of body English or something to get that final rep if it's not like directly taking away from the stimulus, or like if it's like a really like peak contraction dominant exercise like a cable row or some kind of a curl, then bit of body English is fine. But I don't like to miss reps, because by that point I will have pushed myself like really, really far into that high fatigue state, and that does tank my performance a lot. And also like mentally it takes a lot out of me. And of course, like the more taxing the exercise is, the more that is the case. And it's just really like disproportionately tends to tank people's work capacity. There are some exceptions, like Jeffrey Verity Schofield could probably do that like in every set, and he would still get like very similar number of reps for like 6 sets straight or something, but that's rare. So I think that's not the best like management of your recovery resources, but I do like that type of training a lot more than the much more submaximal and a lot more sets. And I think you and I have talked about this, that this whole like, are you ready to train hard? But no. I mean, truly hard. You're gonna die. You're gonna die under the bar and reborn. Like, I think that is a bit of a gimmick.
Yeah.
And is just as much of a fad as the high volume stuff beyond a certain point, I think.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of this, I don't know, belief in the pro, I don't know, like the pro realms, where they will act as if they have this unique ability to tap into, I remember Jerry Ward talking about Jay Cutler, like he could just, he could put in so much effort into one set, and this is not possible for the average human to do. And it's like, well, I'm sure he pushes himself very hard. I don't think he has some unique ability to push harder than every other person. Like, if that's the reason, right? I personally am a fan, probably more than a lot of the evidence-based community. I am a fan of training to failure. I do think there are numerous reasons to do it. I mean, one, just so you can actually determine where that failure point is. 2, because I think it kind of prevents you from sandbagging. 3, because I think that even now, I think there was a recent paper put out on how maybe training to failure is beneficial, although I know there was also Menno putting up that controversial one. But yeah. I do think that most people who, even just anecdotally, who get very far are training very hard for the most part. Again, there's exceptions, but I just don't think that many people who are just going 3 RAR are really, it's the people who we tend to see as making long-term progress. Even the people who advocate occasional periods like that, like RP and Revive Stronger, they still have plenty of periods where they are pushing extremely hard and pushing closer to failure. So I'm a fan of it, but I've not really watched Jordan Peters train, but my understanding is he pushes things extremely hard. And I think probably for most people, if you're doing that all the time on like the big lifts and everything, that could be problematic. I like to keep it to generally 1 set of all-out failure per exercise. And sometimes that's the first exercise, sometimes that is a first set, and then I'll do some back-off sets. So I might do all-out, maybe trying to hit a PR first set, and then the next 2 sets I'll back off, and they're going to be maybe a 2 RAR, right? So that was something I did with my pull-ups for a while. So I would hit maybe like 100 for 6, and then I'd back off, and I'd just go to 45 pounds, and I would just do stricter form, clean, 2 sets of 8. Probably could have gotten 10 to 12 on either of those sets, and they're considerably backed off, but kind of adding volume there, technique work. Or sometimes it'll be the opposite, where I'll do 3 sets of an exercise, and the first one is maybe a 2 RIR, and then it's a 1 IR, and then it's like a true 0 RIR. But in both of these examples, there's still only one set that's completely all out. The other ones are still hard, but they're not, it's like if you had a gun to my head, okay, I could maybe get another couple of reps.
Yeah. And by the way, like Jordan Peters, I just, as you were speaking, like I kind of replayed a couple of snippets in my head that I've seen of him on Instagram. And he is the classic example of someone who, if he was to get some really horrendous injury or like kind of like Dorian Yates style, like gradually tearing up more and more things, then people would be pointing at the failure stuff. But like the thing is that like the guy is, I mean, I don't know, 5'7" and like 300 pounds, or like he actually looks like the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
And he is insanely strong. So like even if he had like a 4 reps in reserve kind of setup, it would still be probably, if he was going to get injured, he would be getting injured with 4 reps in reserve as well. So yeah, like it's just a good illustration of how, when you're that freaking huge and strong, then you're going to be moving some insane weights, and it on an absolute scale is going to be very, very intense pretty much no matter what you do.
Yeah, for sure. All right, next question by Zach. Super random question, or super semi-random question for you. I just watched your podcast with Menno Henselmans. My little brother, who's 23, just hopped on 200 milligrams of TRT a week, and I think he's full of crap and didn't need it. Do you have any sources on what I should read up on to tell if he's full of it? Love the podcast. So
just imagine the doctor saying like, all right, sir, I think we're going to hop on 200 mgs of test.
So almost certainly your brother does not need 200 milligrams of TRT per week. I would say almost nobody needs 200 milligrams of TRT per week. Of the people who need TRT, which is probably, I mean, if you break it down just statistically, how many 23-year-olds need TRT, period? Maybe 1 in 100. I mean, obviously just kind of randomly throwing that out there. Not many, right, who legitimately need TRT, and not, I'm not at 1,000 milligrams or 1,000 nanograms per deciliter, but just you have normal testosterone. Most would be in the normal range, right? And let's say it's 1%. Then how many of those would need to take 200 milligrams per week? Again, effectively none, right? 200 milligrams per week is going to have almost every male out of the normal range, out of the normal reference range and even more so for free testosterone, because TRT seems to bring people's free testosterone up more than total, relatively speaking. And this is actually a way I talk with Dr. Thomas O'Connor and other doctors on this. A lot of times you'll just know right away guys on TRT because their free testosterone is disproportionately high. So your brother's free testosterone is probably double the top of the normal range, or 50% over the top of the normal range on 200 milligrams per week. So he clearly almost certainly does not need it. But then it's like, does he even need TRT? We could make an entire video on how to determine if somebody needs TRT. You have to look at symptoms. If they're not symptomatic, very few people would need it. What is the actual blood levels? Did he get blood work done? Did the doctor have him get blood work done? Did he have him repeat the blood work done while doing it in the morning, right? Or did he just get like a 10 p.m., after dieting for 12 weeks test? So, I mean, again, I could go into a lot of detail, but any additional thoughts there, Abel?
So, I mean, it's just, I'm really curious, like what was going on in the guy's head. Honestly, that's just the main thing that I'm always thinking about. I don't want to be beating the dead horse, because like now it's enough people are talking about how people don't need to be hopping on TRT. And it's because, as you said, how many young, like, especially at 23, I mean, you said 1 out of 100. I would guess it's more like 1 out of 1,000.
Yeah, I mean,
it's if that. But one thing that I wanted to ask back on though is you said that like it's gonna put most people out of the normal range. So like 200, where would you expect that to put like the average person? Because I heard some values which was something like 4 times so like 200 would equal like an 800 nanograms per deciliter reading for the average person, but I don't know where I heard that now, but
yeah, no, definitely not. Yeah. So, and this is, man, there's so much misinformation on this topic. It's honestly just frustrating to even hear sometimes. And, I don't want to try to promote myself as some endocrinologist or anything, but I just have seen so much out there that is very clearly flawed, and by people who are reputable or at least seemingly reputable. I don't want to put specific names, but people who have significant followings, and I just don't understand it because there's data on it. It's not like we have to guess. So if you look at the data on people who take 500 milligrams per week, they can be as high as 3,500 nanograms per deciliter.
Jesus.
And they can be, but again, it depends. So when are you testing it? So one of the problems with some of these studies is that they will take the dose, and something like testosterone cypionate has a 7 to 8 day half-life. So they're taking the blood work done at the end of the week. So by that point, obviously the levels are lower. So what's the area of the curve look like? What was the peak level? Then nowadays, thankfully, a lot of people are recommending more frequent dosing. So maybe they break that up, right? So some people are dosing every single day, right? Some people are dosing every other day. I do think something like at least twice a week is probably a better recommendation than just once a week. But you have to look at what is that blood level going to be throughout the week. So if you were to look at some of the studies, I think in the one that 500 milligrams towards the end of the week, it might have been closer to 2,000 nanograms per deciliter in that one. But again, if you were to take it right afterwards, it would be spiked. There's a doctor who is kind of in the space. You'll see his name around here and there, who I've mentioned before, has said that he doesn't think any male should be taking less than 200 milligrams per week, which again is just absolutely insane. And he wants people to be above the reference range at the end of the week, meaning he has them at higher than the reference range all week. But no, the whole 4 times aspect you mentioned definitely is not accurate. Most men, to truly be at an average level, like just 600 to 800 nanograms per deciliter, would be fine on probably about 100 to 125 milligrams per week. That would be like a general rule of thumb.
So then like right after, or like the next day, like after administration, they would be then probably higher still. So
potentially, yeah, and then lower. And again, that's why I like to break it up. So I would say, like, if you took the average man and you broke that up into 2 times per week, like 50 to 62.5 milligrams Sunday and 50 to 62.5 milligrams Wednesday, then they'd probably be averaging about 600 to 800 nanograms per deciliter in the morning. But again, I don't, some people could easily put on here and say, well, I take this and my levels are this. There's absolutely going to be significant variation between people here. But generally speaking, when somebody tells me 200, 250, I mean, that's really like sports TRT, quote unquote, or TRT plus, as some people say. People who are on legitimate TRT sometimes are taking, I mean, one client I had in Australia was taking 1,000 milligrams every 3 months because he was on undecanoate. So that's like a very long acting one. And again, if you just look at like the average of that over that time period, it's more in line with what I'm saying. Legitimate TRT, just to be middle. And again, I understand some people's points. Like Menno said, if he goes on TRT, he would want to be at the top end of the range. And I do understand that. But if you're truly just like, a guy who's just 45 years old, you don't really care about the gym that much, you just actually need testosterone replacement therapy, 80 to 100 milligrams a week can be life-changing for somebody who's actually hypogonadal. You know what I mean? And that'll just put you in normal levels. This is one of my frustrations when I hear people say, oh, well, look at this guy. He's like really jacked. He's got to be on at least TRT. Because by saying he's got to be on at least TRT, you're suggesting that TRT would be making a substantial difference above being natural. And the reality is, while it is different, and I've made the point in my podcast and a video with Menno that especially when being contest lean, it does make a big difference. The reality is, if you're just talking about like a 15% body fat male, somebody who was, let's say, naturally at 500 nanograms per deciliter, if that person then took legitimate 80 to 100 milligrams TRT per week, they should not see much of a difference. They might gain a couple pounds of muscle, lose a couple pounds of fat, but to average people, they'll look exactly the same. And this idea that like just TRT is going to make some gigantic difference is only propagated by the fact that people in the industry are often lying about how much they're taking and saying it's TRT.
Yeah, although like it is kind of crazy. We talked about this, I think, even on a podcast, that like people who have blasted before, like, okay, you would say like, okay, they're maintaining a bit more because of TRT, so they will lose some. But like in Børge Fagerli's case, for example, like he discussed this pretty openly, so I can say it, like he has done cycles in the past and he has maintained a very, very impressive physique, like, I don't know, 100 kilos, so 220 pounds, lean, at like 6'1" or so. And he was on 100 milligrams per week. And then he went off of that eventually. And he lost like, I don't know, like 10 kilos or so of lean mass. Like that's pretty crazy that it can make that big of a difference.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I do want to clarify, there does seem to be I'm talking about somebody who's never done any cycles before, who then goes on. There's no chance that if let's say he's 200 pounds, right? And Børge in this case, there's no chance if he was 200 pounds and he went on 100 milligrams of TRT a week that he's going to go up to 220 pounds at the same leanness. Yeah. No way. And I've had two people on my podcast who, one openly enhanced, the other one, I believe, was enhanced, less open about it, who said that TRT makes like a 20-pound difference in their case. Again, if you have cycled up and held very high body weights and musculature and then go on TRT, even 100 to 125 milligrams per week, massive difference compared to coming off. John Meadows talked about this, Scott Stevenson, Dante Trudell. Assuming they're honest, and I believe these guys are honest, they have talked about holding far more. Ken Skip Hill, another one, talked about holding far more mass after blasting for years by just staying on TRT. If they come off fully, I think because they're basically going hypogonadal, right? I mean, even if they eventually recover, you're having this huge hypogonadal period after being on for so many years. Yeah. That is very different, though.
Yeah, and so obviously you can only speculate about this, but like just the John Meadows thing reminded me, because I think he was on 200. That's what I always remember.
Had the heart attack, then went down to 100.
Okay. So, I mean, poor guy was not on 100 for long enough so that we could know this, but like between 200, so if someone done cycles in the past, let's say he's 220, what do you think the difference would be between 200 and 100? Like, would it be, if the difference between like hypogonadal versus TRT would be 20 pounds potentially, then between 200 and 100, would it be what, 10 pounds, or what would you guess?
So obviously this is pure speculation and it's going to depend on so much else. In that particular example, if I imagine somebody was able to maintain 220 on 200 milligrams and dropped all the way down to 200 by coming off everything, I would guess they would still maintain like 215 on 100, because there's such a big difference by that huge drop, right? That huge crash is such a big problem for a lot of these guys because they've been suppressed for a decade. And there's just such a massive difference there. And again, TRT does maintain your levels at that constant, it does fluctuate throughout the week, but it's not going to have that daily rhythm where you're going to have the crashes every day. So, although even that is a little bit exaggerated, if you were to look at somebody's levels at night and in the morning, it's not like somebody's going to be at 1,000 in the morning and they're going to be at 200 at night. I mean, I've tested my own in the morning and at night, and it was like 600 versus 400, I mean, at least for me personally. So it wasn't like some gigantic difference.
Right.
Yeah. Did Børge eventually go back on TRT after he had the big drop?
No, he, it was a long process for him, but that was his goal, that he wanted to restore himself to completely drug free. And,
so did he maintain anything after all that?
So at first he lost a lot. I actually have not asked, because that was a while ago that we talked about this. But I'm gonna ask where he managed to climb back to.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know, because that's tough, man. That's honestly one of the biggest reasons that I would not want to blast, is because I just think of it as I mean, it's already psychologically hard enough to get older and to realize that at some point you're not going to lift the same weights and you're not going to look the same and all these things. But to get to such an epic peak and then be 20 to 30 pounds less muscular after that, I can understand why a lot of people come off gear and then they just stop lifting, right? Because it's just, you got to be so depressing.
Well, I mean, if you don't go on TRT, a lot of people stay on that. Or that would be obvious in your case that like you would come off completely.
If I was gonna blast for 5 years, I think I would just stay on TRT afterwards, presumably. Right. I mean, I'd have to see obviously how the body responds and everything. It's very theoretical, but I don't know. And then I know a few people. I have like friends who are like, "Oh, I can't wait till like done having kids at 40, and then I can blast." And I was like, "Well, that's kind of like the worst time to do it, right? You have all the health issues and." By that point, like, do you still care about being as muscular as possible? I mean, I imagine these guys, once they get to 40, are not going to care. But it's something I
probably not.
I see. Yeah, people who are like in their 20s, like, yeah, once I get to this age, I'm just going to blast. It's like, well, I guess maybe.
Yeah, it's like the kid. Like, I cannot wait until I have my own money, and then I'm going to buy all this candy in the store and whatever.
I was definitely that kid, man. I remember like chicken wings or like Chinese food as like a fat 8 to 10-year-old, just thinking one day I would just do this, and then I got my license and I could drive anywhere, and I was like, oh, I don't actually care.
Yeah, pretty much the same.
Yeah. This one's definitely more for you. Thoughts on the content and theories of Paul Carter and Beardsley's podcast? I've never seen them, so any thoughts from you, Abel?
Paul Carter and Beardsley have a podcast?
Maybe they're two individual podcasts. So this is Chris Beardsley. I know the name. Right. I've not seen either of their content, unfortunately, so I can't answer that.
Okay, I will definitely look into this. Or maybe they just did one podcast together. Who knows? So Paul Carter. Well, actually, let's start with Chris Beardsley. He is a very smart guy, but he's just like, from what I've seen, he has just been less actively talking about these topics that we followed him for. Or maybe he was even on the Iron Culture podcast. Like there I recall him saying something that about like not really like doing much with bodybuilding and like hypertrophy research anymore. So, but I don't know. It would be cool if he did, because I did enjoy reading his stuff. Paul Carter, I will say that I do like his exercise demonstration videos. I actually saw some cool ideas from him, even some cool little hacks, like how to set up the bench and the distance from the bench when you're doing a Bulgarian split squat. I thought that was really cool, for example. And yeah, like the guy definitely has some valuable stuff to share. He is a bit of a lunatic, and so like I don't know, he's just like one of these constantly pissed off people. Like the kind of person that you would rather just leave alone that day, because like you're sleep deprived and you're like the Snickers commercial, like, hey, right. You're not yourself when you're hungry.
Yeah. Right.
And plus, like, these people who you get the feeling that they don't even really understand what they're saying, but they're just regurgitating some like really fancy words that they heard from somewhere. It's like this hydrogen ion thing is his favorite. Like he just cannot stop repeating that. So yeah, I'm convinced that a lot of this has to do with hydrogen ion fatigue. Like what? Like hydrogen ion fatigue? Like so they get tired? Like, yeah. So it's more or less it. Like it's kind of like the what do you have in the US? Costco. That would be like what Tesco is over here. So he would be the Tesco or Costco version of Kasim Henson. That's right. As far as I'm concerned.
That's funny. Yeah, I know so many people I hear talk about them. I haven't checked out their content. So do facial muscles actually hypertrophy after years of lifting due to strain when pushing hard? I would say yes, although you ever see mewing? You ever see people talk about mewing?
That was just what I was gonna ask. I just thought about this randomly the other day.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, any muscle you work is going to hypertrophy. I have patients who I will give Botox to in their masseter muscles and sometimes their temporalis muscle for a number of reasons. If they're clenching, there's some women who you could probably even just Google it, you'll see where they actually look like they got leaner because their masseters are so big. It gives them these kind of like full cheeks. And then over time, those will kind of slim down. People get headaches from a lot of clenching. Sometimes we'll do Botox for that as well. But yeah, so if you're working it, I don't know necessarily just from lifting, but hopefully you're not clenching a ton while you're lifting. I mean, obviously you're going to strain, but hopefully you're not actually just like clenching down on your jaw like crazy. I know some people will wear actually like a bite guard while they lift. But yeah, I think generally if you look at somebody who's gained 50 pounds of muscle overall, I mean, their neck, their jaw, everything is going to kind of change muscularly.
Yeah, actually. So what is mewing?
Mewing is this, there's like a device and like they'll actually just kind of be like chewing on it and they'll argue there's these different benefits for it. Some people are just for the jaw aesthetics of it. It's not something that I'm like super well versed in. I've just kind of seen it around.
And so I was going to ask, like, so you as someone who does these aesthetic surgeries and, you know, people who work in that field as well, what's going on? So this is something I have a very hard time just wrapping my head around, that I'm seeing some of these millionaire superstars from Hollywood and some of these surgeries that they have. Like I watched the Friends reunion show.
Yeah.
And like Jennifer Aniston and all of these people who look like really good in Friends, and it's like, what happened to you? It looks horrible. And how can that happen? Like, what's going on with these?
A lot of times that's just too much filler. You know, I did see the Friends reunion, or I saw a scene or two from the Friends reunion, and I mean, part of it's just age, right? So sometimes you'll see these people who they'll do these videos of like then and now, and like, you know, and it's actually very consistent in the comment section. You'll get people who say, "Oh my God, they were so much prettier before they got all this plastic surgery." And it's like, yeah, because you're looking at a picture of them when they were 20 years old, and now you're looking at a picture of them when they were 40 years old. You're like, "Oh my God, look what they ruined their face." It's like they aged 20 years. Like they're not going to look exactly the same. So that is, I know that's not what you're saying, but I'm just, a lot of times I do want to point that out because a lot of the time you'll see that and it's like, of course they're not going to look as good at 40 compared to 20, you know, with some of these women in Hollywood. Secondly, I do think I'm not a big fan of filler to the extent that it's often used. I think Botox can actually be great from a quote unquote anti-aging, again, just aesthetically standpoint, because essentially you're just removing the ability to create wrinkles, right? So how Botox works is it's actually kind of knocking out the ability of the muscle to contract. That's why we'll do it in the masseters and temporalis, so people actually cannot strain to the same extent. But when people get it in their forehead or, you know, the crow's feet and whatnot, they will essentially not get the wrinkles there because they can't use the function. So I, you know, sometimes you'll see like botched Botox and whatnot, and somebody's like eyebrows up here or, you know, whatever. But the reality is Botox is relatively safe. Botox doesn't tend to even be noticed when done correctly. Whereas filler, there's more potential risk, especially like if it were to get into a vessel with filler. But also that's when you tend to see a lot of these women in their 40s and 50s and whatnot, where like their cheeks are just, because they'll do the filler here with the idea being to kind of lift. So their face is starting to sag. So they'll do filler to kind of try to push things up. Problem is, it's actually been shown in some MRIs now recently that filler, they'll tell you it lasts 6 to 12 months. It seems like it actually sticks around for a much longer period of time. And so there's some MRI showing that people had filler there 10 years later, but it had just kind of drifted. So you get somebody who's had years and years and years of filler and their faces are puffy and maybe it looks good in this one straight shot. So they'll be like, oh, wow, that looks great. But then they'll turn and it's just like, oh, like you could just kind of see that look. And I honestly, again, I don't want to ignore the thing I just said about Botox, how you often just think of the worst case scenario. I understand that happens with filler too. We'll see the worst case scenario. But to me, it's just much more common that it's a problem. You know, if you have so many people with millions and millions of dollars who still can't seem to get it right and still look so ridiculous, you got to think at that point, maybe it's a problem with the procedure and not just like you went to a bad person, you know? I've seen filler look really good if done in modest amounts in the lips in the under eyes and things like that. But once you start trying to get into like lifting the cheeks and all these things, or like I don't know if that's what Zac Efron had, but he had something going on there with like this big puffy face. That is when I think it becomes problematic. And so I did see in that reunion, whoever plays Monica, that actress, she had like way too much stuff done.
And Ross
looked,
was,
yeah. Now he actually, I think he just also gained a lot of weight. I think his was a combination of
probably
fat gain and filler. So of course, when you get the combination, you get these super puffy faces. And then people talk about, oh, well, you can dissolve it. But the problem is like you dissolve it with something called hyaluronidase, but that some people will say there's nothing to show that it will dissolve the natural hyaluronic acid because so that's what it, for people, let me back up a second. People who don't know, a lot of the fillers are hyaluronic acid, like a gel. And so you can dissolve that with hyaluronidase, but the problem is your body naturally has hyaluronic acid in it. And so theoretically, you could dissolve your natural hyaluronic acid. And that's kind of disputed. Some people say that that's never been shown to do that and there's no problems with it. But I've certainly anecdotally heard of people who kind of get some indentations afterwards. So it just gets into like a kind of tricky realm, and I'm not a big fan of like the big lip filler lips that you see some of these people, like all the girls on Jersey Shore have. I just think it's such an odd look. So yeah, I don't know. It's a little ramble there, I guess.
Yeah, well, I definitely planning to have the most horribly like baggy, like wrinkly eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I just am slightly sleep deprived, which does happen pretty like frequently enough to where usually it looks like that, and it's yeah, it's going to be. But like now I'm scared. Like what would happen if I was to do that? Like would someone completely mess me up? But
yeah, you gotta
I would think it's
qualified for sure. The bags though, there's two different things though, because it might be not that you would need not that you would need filler, but you would need a blepharoplasty would be for like the big baggy under eyes. So that's a different procedure.
All right, we'll see.
Yeah. Let's see. So